I still remember the exact moment my heart stopped beating the way it used to. The music was soft, a string quartet playing something elegant, something expensive, and the guests were seated beneath chandeliers that looked like they'd been stolen from a royal palace. I was sitting at the far end of the room, tucked behind a tall centerpiece that blocked most of my view. Then I heard it. "Mom, could you help me fix my veil?" Every head turned toward the aisle, and I looked up, smiling instinctively until I realized she wasn't talking to me. She was talking to Vivian Lancaster, her husband's mother, and the crowd smiled warmly at the touching sight of a bride and her mother. I just sat there, frozen. My hands trembled on my lap, and I could feel a burn crawl up my throat, the kind that happens when you're holding back everything, the tears, the words, the years. My daughter, Sophie, was standing under those golden lights in a gown I paid for, at a venue I funded, while pretending I didn't exist. And when one of Liam's cousins whispered, "Who's that lady by the staff table? The maid?" they all laughed, including Sophie. That's the moment I knew something inside me had shifted. I wasn't her mother anymore, at least, not in this room. But what they didn't know was that I had come prepared for this. They thought I'd come just to watch. They had no idea that every flower, every chandelier, every catered dish in that room was sitting there because of me. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches, because maybe, somewhere out there, another mother needs to hear it. It's strange how the people you love most can become strangers right in front of your eyes. When I looked at Sophie that day, it wasn't the little girl who used to run into my arms after school. It was someone else entirely, someone who had traded honesty for elegance, roots for reputation. I raised Sophie alone after my husband died in a car accident when she was 9. He was a mechanic, just like me. We owned Turner Auto Repairs, a small garage in Charleston that we built with scraped knuckles and borrowed money. When he passed, I worked 12-hour days. I missed holidays, skipped birthdays, and said no to myself so I could say yes to her. I made sure she had everything. I didn't piano lessons, private school, college. Every time she wanted something, I told myself, one day, she'll understand. But that day never came. Sophie grew up watching the wives of Charleston's upper class drop their cars off at my shop, diamonds flashing, nails perfect, accents sharp as glass. I think that's when she decided that being like me wasn't enough. By the time she met Liam Lancaster, the heir to a banking family, Sophie stopped mentioning where she came from altogether. She didn't tell them her mother fixed engines. She told them I ran a small business. And now here I was, surrounded by 500 of Charleston's most polished people, watching my daughter call someone else mom. Every laugh, every sideways glance at my simple navy blue dress felt like 1,000 tiny cuts, but I didn't let it show. I sat there, back straight, hands folded, letting them think I was small. Because if there's one thing I've learned from years under the hood of a car, it's that power doesn't always make noise. The first time I met Liam's parents, they looked at me like I was a contractor who had walked into the wrong room. Vivian Lancaster smiled, that polite, sugar-coated smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Oh, you own a car shop? How industrious." I remember nodding, forcing a smile back. I didn't care about what she thought until I realized Sophie did. After that dinner, Sophie asked me not to wear my work uniform to her apartment anymore. She started talking about image, about blending in. And I saw her slowly drift toward a world where money wasn't just comfort, it was identity. At first, I told myself she was just growing up, trying to fit in. But it wasn't about fitting in. It was about erasing where she came from. So when she announced she wanted to get married at the Grand Oaks Mansion, a venue that costs more per night than my first shop made in a month, I told her I'd pay for it. Not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted her to know I still believed in her dream. I paid for the gown, the catering, the decorations, even the orchestra. But when I arrived on the wedding day, they placed me at a table near the kitchen. My name wasn't even on the family list. They called me Elizabeth Never Mom. I didn't say a word. Not when they whispered, not when they laughed, not even when Vivian put her hand around Sophie and said, "You've made me so proud, darling." I just smiled, quietly, and thought, you have no idea how much this night truly costs. People often mistake silence for weakness. But silence can be the sharpest weapon in the room if you know when to use it. That night, as Sophie and Liam danced beneath the crystal lights, I sat with my purse resting on my lap inside it, a folder holding every invoice, every contract, every transaction that had built that wedding from the ground up. The Grand Oaks mansion, paid in full. The caterers, paid in full. The dress, paid in full. All by me. I listened to them toast the Lancaster legacy and the family that made this dream possible, and I thought to myself, they really think I'll sit here and let them rewrite the story I bled to create. So I waited. I watched them dance, smile, toast, and when the moment was right, I decided this was the last time anyone in that room would laugh at me. They thought I'd stay quiet. They forgot who paid for this fairy tale. Because before that night was over, they would learn that sometimes the quietest woman in the room holds the loudest truth. I remember the way the light danced across the marble floors of the Grand Oaks mansion that morning. It was the kind of glow that made everything look expensive, as if even the air shimmered with privilege. The chandeliers hung low, catching every breath of the breeze, scattering it into diamonds across white roses and silver tablecloths. A string quartet rehearsed in the corner, their melody floating between laughter, perfume, and champagne. I should have felt proud. After all, I paid for every inch of it, from the crystal stemware to the imported silk drapes. But standing there, surrounded by Charleston's finest, I felt invisible. They had seated me near the catering staff. My table was tucked by the kitchen door, close enough to hear the metallic clang of trays and the murmurs of waiters rushing past. I told myself it didn't matter, that Sophie was happy, that was all that mattered. But happiness has a way of twisting when you realize you've bought it for someone else, and it came without a seat for you. Vivian Lancaster, Liam's mother, was everywhere that day. Her smile wide, her pearls perfect, her voice just loud enough to be overheard. She floated from guest to guest, touching arms, kissing cheeks, claiming credit for ideas that weren't hers. Yes, the roses were my idea, she said. Oh, the cake? Sophie and I wanted something elegant. I stood nearby, holding my breath, pretending not to notice as my daughter smiled along. Not once did she mention the small-town garage that paid for it all. Sophie used to love the smell of motor oil. I can still see her at 12 years old, sitting on the counter in my shop, swinging her legs, humming along to the radio while I worked. She'd hold the flashlight steady for me, her hair tied back with a bandana, grease smudged on her cheeks. "Mom," she'd say, "someday I'll buy you a house by the water." I believed her. Maybe I wanted to. But that was before Liam. He came from a world Sophie had only seen in magazines, one of gala dinners, polo matches, and names that opened doors. When she brought him home, his handshake was polite but cool, the kind of greeting you give someone you've already judged. "So, you own a car shop?" he asked, scanning my small living room like it was a museum of the poor. Sophie laughed nervously. "Mom's just being humble," she said. "She runs a business. It's successful." That was the first time I felt her distance, like a glass wall sliding between us. From then on, our talks changed. She spoke of things like reputation and image. Her wardrobe shifted. Her tone softened when she spoke to me, as if I might embarrass her just by existing. During the wedding planning, she'd avoid mentioning me in front of Vivian. I remember sitting through those meetings at the Lancaster estate rooms, so polished you could see your reflection in the floors. Vivian would say things like, "Of course, Sophie, we'll cover the cost of the rehearsal dinner," and Sophie would glance at me quickly, her eyes pleading for silence. She didn't want anyone to know I'd already written the check. I told myself it was fine. A mother doesn't count what she gives. But that night, when I overheard two guests whisper, it cut deeper than I expected. "Who invited the maid?" one woman said, stifling a laugh behind her champagne flute. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see their manicured fingers pointing toward me. My dress was simple, navy blue, the same one I'd worn to church a few months back. I'd spent hours pressing it, wanting to look neat, respectful. But next to the sequins and diamonds, I suppose I did look out of place. I forced a smile, pretending not to hear, pretending not to care. Then I saw Sophie. She was radiant, glowing under the lights. Liam's arm wrapped proudly around her waist. And for a moment, I almost convinced myself the whispers didn't matter, that all those years of scraping by, saving pennies, skipping meals just to afford her tuition and later this wedding, were worth it. But when she introduced Vivian to one of the guests and said, "This is my mom," something inside me froze. Vivian beamed, soaking in the attention, her diamond earrings catching the light. My breath caught. My cup trembled in my hand. I waited for Sophie to correct herself, to laugh and say she'd misspoken. She didn't. The guest smiled warmly and turned to me. "And you are?" I swallowed hard. "I'm Elizabeth," I said. No title, no recognition, no mother, just Elizabeth. The conversation moved on without me. My name hung in the air for a moment, then dissolved like it had never existed. I excused myself quietly and stepped outside. The evening air was cool, sharp against my cheeks. I leaned against one of the pillars, listening to the distant music echo through the courtyard. In that silence, memories came rushing back my late husband's hands. Rough but gentle, the sound of his laughter in the garage, the promise we made to each other, to give Sophie a better life. He died before he could see her grow up, before he could see how hard I fought to keep that promise. I thought I had honored his dream, but standing there, surrounded by the very people who looked down on me, I realized I'd built a kingdom that had no throne for me. I returned to my seat, my face calm, my heart a storm. Vivian laughed across the room, unaware of the quiet promise I made to myself that night. They thought I was small. They mistook my silence for weakness, but they forgot who paid for the fairy tale they were standing in. Still, I chose grace. I smiled through the night, toasted the couple, and hugged Sophie tightly when she said her goodbyes. My voice didn't shake. My eyes didn't give me away. Because I knew the story wasn't over. It was only beginning. And though I sat at the edge of that golden room, treated like an outsider in a celebration I'd built, I knew something they didn't. Every empire built on borrowed kindness eventually learns who the true builder was. They thought I'd fade into the background, but I was only stepping back watching, waiting, remembering. And when the time came, I wouldn't need to raise my voice or seek revenge loudly. No, I'd let the truth do that for me. If you're watching this video, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story reaches because maybe, just maybe, another mother somewhere needs to be reminded, silence doesn't mean surrender. The cameras never stopped clicking the moment Vivian stepped forward to take someone else's place. Flashbulbs popped like distant thunder while she smiled and hugged Sophie, and every image that went out from that room carried the same lie. The Lancasters were the family, and I was a footnote. I folded the napkin on my lap until the fabric softened beneath my fingertips, counting beats and breaths, cataloging every face and every expression as if I were inventorying evidence. A reporter 2 tables over murmured into his phone about a feel-good Charleston wedding, oblivious to the ledger entries that would contradict his trending headline. Memory doesn't always arrive in order. Sometimes it comes as a film strip of moments that stitch themselves into a pattern only you can see. I remembered the night Sophie left for college, and how she hugged me at the bus stop like she might never return. I remembered the first check I wrote, when she decided on a venue far beyond what our taxes and normal wages would cover. The single line of ink that turned my savings into the backdrop for other people's applause. I remembered her voice on the phone at 1 a.m., excited and slightly distant, listing floral options she'd picked at Vivian's suggestion. "It'll look so much better with peonies," she said, and I pictured the peonies on tables I had paid for while her words floated somewhere between intimacy and distance. There were nights I replayed the conversations we used to have. Grease-stained hands, radio on low, Sophie perched on a crate, asking about carburetors and tiny things that mattered only to a handful of people. She used to be genuinely fascinated by the smell of benzene and brake cleaner. It's a small, strange thing to miss, but it was the texture of our life. That texture eroded with each dinner at the Lancasters' estate, each compliment offered to Sophie about having such good taste, and with each compliment, a bit of our shared history slipped away. She stopped bringing up my shop in polite company. When people asked what I did, she offered faint descriptions. "She runs a business," she'd say, as if that phrase would make everything palatable. On the day of the reception, the vendors wheeled in silver platters like they were presenting trophies. The event coordinator checked the seating chart 3 times and smiled at Vivian like she was the designer of the entire evening, never once glancing at the small placard with my name that had been tucked near the billing table. I watched a server line the salads with the exact precision of surgical hands, and I thought about all the years I'd spent teaching apprentices how to thread a spark plug, how to balance a tire. I thought about the apprenticeship program I'd quietly funded in our shop for local kids so they could earn while they learned. I had set aside a scholarship fund in my business account for promising young technicians. None of that appeared in any of the champagne toasts. There were moments that felt like salt. Someone at the bar commenting to a friend, "I thought her dress was a costume," and another woman responding with a giggle that polished cruelty into an artifact. I turned over those jibes in my head and catalogued them the same way I had catalogued invoices who said what, and when, and to whom. They were not mere cutting remarks. They were the map of how a narrative was being rewritten around me. In the quiet between dance sets, I pictured the list of payments on my phone like a ledger of betrayals. Transfers to the Grand Oaks, deposits to the florist, the balance to the venue, the fee to the orchestra. There, in that clean column of numbers, was the truth that did not match the image being curated under the chandeliers. It is an odd comfort to be able to name the gears that turn the world. While they clinked glasses and arranged their selfies, I could name the account numbers and routing numbers, the dates of wire transfers, the signatures that tied my name to every vendor. Turner Auto Repairs had grown slowly, a location at a time, until what was once a single bay garage was a string of shops across the state. Sumter, Myrtle Beach, Somerville, a lean management team I trusted, and an accountant who balanced books with the kind of care most people reserve for family heirlooms. People saw the glossy side of success when they drove past the newly painted signs on Highway 17. They didn't see the nights of closing the garage with the lights off and doing payroll from the trunk of my car. That history mattered as much as any diamond ring. At some point earlier in the evening, a vendor had leaned toward me in an attempt at small talk and voiced concern about a missing final check. His tone was perfunctory, the kind of anxiety you hear when someone worries about a dinner seating. He assumed, as everyone else did, that the family had placed the funds. He didn't know the checks had already been cut, cleared, and filed under an innocuous label in my ledger. I let him worry politely, and when he moved on, I allowed a small, private smile to touch my lips. There was a certain poetry in watching them run in confusion, unaware their problem was a problem I could solve on my own terms. There were obstacles I had to acknowledge in private. The cost of exposure, the ways in which calling attention to who had paid could humiliate Sophie beyond repair, the potential legal entanglements that might drag my name into courtrooms and gossip columns I preferred to avoid. I thought of my husband and the way he taught me to measure twice and cut once. This would be measured. This would be precise. I would not be loud for the sake of noise. I would assemble facts and present them in a way that could not be ignored. I began to collect proof with the care of someone preparing a case. Contracts were photocopied. Bills were stacked in order. Emails were printed and threaded, like a story of decision and payment. There was a line item for the tenting at the gardens, for the number of chairs, for overtime fees to the cleaners, small things a planner would consider incidental until you were the one who had paid for them. There were signature blocks with my handwriting, routing confirmations that carried the bank's blue stamp, and a deposit receipt from a dress shop where Sophie had been fitted. Each document was a stitch in the tapestry I was weaving, and together they formed an irrefutable image of authorship. I arranged them into a folder the color of sober things and tucked it into my purse, a silent weapon that weighed more than any resentment. In private, I replayed conversations with Sophie that had gnawed at me for months. She had told me, in a voice that had learned the cadence of compromise, that certain things would be embarrassing for her if I showed up as I was. She had asked me to avoid certain outfits, to soften the sound of my laugh at gatherings, to disappear gently. I had obliged, because disappearing for her happiness seemed a small price to pay. But there is a moment in every story when the cost of disappearance becomes more than you are willing to bear, and that night, under the weight of 1,000 smiles that felt like knives, I reached that point. My resolve did not come from spite. It came from a refusal to be erased. One of the caterers, a man with flour on his forearms and the easy dignity of someone who knows labor, came up to me near closing and whispered that the staff was concerned. Without the final settlement, they could not pay their overtime, and some families of employees depended on those wages. The man looked at me with an expression that asked me not for money, but for mercy. It was the cheapest, the cleanest way to make my choice. I felt the surge of responsibility, the way a mechanic feels the pull of a bolt that refuses to budge. You don't force it, you find the right angle. So I did not stand up right then. I did not make a scene by the dessert table. Instead, I laid out the invoices in my mind the way one lays out parts before rebuilding an engine. I organized who needed to be told first: the venue manager, the lead caterer, the orchestra's booking agent. I composed the sentences I would use, direct, clear, and devoid of emotional flourishes that might dilute the facts. My plan was a sequence of moves that, if executed carefully, would expose the facade and let the truth ripple outward without the desperate undertow of public spectacle. There were also quieter strategies. I remembered a clause in the contract with the venue. In the event of undisclosed funding conflicts, the venue reserved the right to renegotiate public credit. I had that clause marked weeks before, not as a hope, but as an option. I thought about the public relations machine the Lancasters had access to, and I thought about how narratives are managed, spun, and sometimes whitewashed. I would not let their narrative stand unchallenged. If their version of the night painted them as benevolent hosts, I would present the receipts and signatures that showed otherwise. The ledger would speak. The dates and amounts did not lie. Late into the reception, while a string quartet played a waltz no one noticed anymore, I gathered the documents, closed my purse, and felt the weight of that folder like a promise. I had every transfer confirmation, every signed estimate, every email that said, "Please proceed." I had the names of the people who had carried tables and the ones who had negotiated deposits. I had composed my words and rehearsed them in my head until they felt as steady as a piston's rhythm. I was not seeking vengeance for the sake of spectacle. I wanted a recalibration of truth. I wanted the record set straight. As the waltz neared its last notes, and the room began to shift toward more dancing and less conversation, I resolved the sequence in my mind. I would speak, I would show, I would leave no room for reasonable doubt. They would not be able to paint me as an angry outsider because the facts would lie in neat columns, stamped by banks and signed with my hand. If they had chosen to rewrite history in the glare of chandeliers, then they would find that history stubborn and fully documented. When I rose from my chair, it was with the quiet steadiness of someone who has learned to carry heavy things without flinching. I folded the napkin and placed it gently on the table, stood with the kind of measured composure I had practiced for years, and walked toward the microphone with a folder that contained the truth of an entire life's investment. The room shimmered with golden light as the orchestra softened into the background, and the clinking of glasses filled the air. Vivian Lancaster rose gracefully from her seat, her diamond bracelet catching the light, and raised her champagne flute. The crowd turned their gaze toward her, the matriarch of wealth, elegance, and everything Sophie had tried so desperately to become. Her voice carried easily across the room, polished and practiced. "To family," she said, pausing for effect, "to love, and to the beautiful union of our children, Sophie and Liam." Applause followed, smooth and eager, like waves meeting the shore. Sophie stood beside her new husband, her eyes gleaming, her laughter delicate. She looked at Vivian with admiration and affection, and when she said, "Thank you, Mom and Dad Lancaster, for everything," it was almost casual, as if that small word, "Mom," hadn't just sliced through me like glass. I stood at the edge of the crowd, microphone in hand. My reflection trembled faintly in the tall crystal glass nearby, and for a fleeting moment I saw not the mother who had been erased, but the woman who had built an empire from oil-stained hands. I waited until the last of the clapping died down. Then I stepped forward. "Before we continue celebrating," I said softly but firmly, my voice steady enough to silence the chatter. Heads turned. Conversations halted. Even the waiters froze in motion, caught between duty and curiosity. "I think it's time the guests know who paid for tonight." A murmur rippled through the ballroom. Cameras tilted. Guests exchanged uncertain glances, the kind that hover between amusement and alarm. Sophie blinked rapidly, confusion flashing across her face. Liam glanced at her, waiting for context, but she had none to give. "I'm sure you've all heard," I continued, walking closer to the stage, "that this beautiful celebration was made possible by the Lancaster family." I stopped, letting the weight of that assumption fill the air. But that isn't quite true. A tremor of unease moved through the room. I placed the folder on the podium and opened it slowly, the sound of paper crisp against the silence. Every flower you see tonight, I said, holding up an invoice, was ordered by me, paid in full, from my business account. I turned another page, the catering 300 guests worth of gourmet dining charged to my name. Gasps began to spread through the hall like sparks catching dry grass. The ballroom, the orchestra, the decor, even the dress my daughter is wearing. I continued, funded entirely by Turner Auto Repairs, my company, my work, my sacrifice. The air thickened. Sophie's face drained of color, her painted smile faltering as if she could will it back into place. Liam's eyes flickered from me to his wife, searching for an explanation. Vivian lowered her glass slowly, her expression locked somewhere between disbelief and indignation. I didn't do this for recognition, I said. I did it because I believed in my daughter, because every mother dreams of seeing her child happy. I didn't mind staying in the background. I didn't mind being the quiet one. But to be erased, to be called the maid at a wedding I paid for, that's a cruelty no mother deserves. The silence grew heavier, trembling under the weight of truth. Somewhere in the back, a chair scraped softly against the marble floor. A camera flash went off, followed by a hush so deep that even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. I opened the final envelope in my folder and held up a check, a single slip of paper, embossed and clean. This, I said, my voice steady, is the final payment to the Grand Oaks mansion, $510,000. The number hung in the air like a confession. It was supposed to clear tomorrow morning, but I think tonight is a better time to make my final decision. With deliberate care, I took the check between my fingers. The room leaned in collectively, and then, with one motion, I tore it in half. The sound was soft, almost too small for the moment, but it carried like thunder. Whispers erupted instantly. The caterer gasped. The orchestra faltered mid-note. A woman near the front covered her mouth, eyes wide. "What is she doing?" someone whispered. "Is she serious?" Vivian's polished smile cracked. She rose, voice trembling. "Mrs. Turner, this isn't the time." "Oh, I think it is," I interrupted calmly. "Because you see, I've been silent for long enough. I've watched people rewrite my place in my own daughter's story. I've watched her turn my sacrifices into embarrassment, and I've watched every single one of you applaud a performance built on lies." Sophie took a step forward, her voice small. "Mom, please." "No," I said, the word gentle but unyielding. "You called me the maid. You let them laugh. You let them believe I didn't belong here." I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the guests, who now couldn't look away. "So let's correct that misunderstanding, shall we?" I turned toward the audience. "A maid doesn't fund your fairy tales." The sentence cut through the air like glass through silk. Then came the sound, not applause, not gasps, but stunned silence. It was the kind of silence that leaves no room for pretending. Sophie's knees buckled slightly. Liam reached for her, his confusion turning to something sharper realization. Betrayal. "You said your family handled everything," he muttered under his breath, not realizing his microphone had caught the words. A few guests heard. Then more. It spread like wildfire. Vivian's face flushed, her hands trembling as she adjusted her pearl necklace. "This is outrageous," she said, but her voice cracked halfway through the word. The photographers, ever faithful to drama, began snapping pictures not of Sophie's smile, not of Liam's embrace, but of me, the mother no one expected to stand. The band stopped playing. The laughter faded. Conversations turned into hushed disbelief. The grandeur of the Grand Oaks felt suddenly hollow, like a set built for a play that had just lost its script. Sophie began to cry, mascara streaking down her face. "I didn't mean," she tried, reaching for me. But I stepped back. "You meant every choice you made, and now you'll have to live with them." Liam's jaw tightened. He looked at his wife, really looked for perhaps the first time. "Did you ever tell me?" he asked quietly. "That your mother?" Sophie couldn't speak. I placed the torn check on the podium, the pieces fluttering slightly under the soft breeze from the ceiling fan. I looked around the room one last time at the chandeliers, the polished marble, the faces that once looked down on me. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," I said softly. "The bills have been settled except for the cost of truth." Then I set the microphone down. The faint sound of it hitting the stand echoed in the silence like a gavel. I turned and began to walk toward the exit. my heels clicking against the floor, slow, deliberate, final. Behind me, the room dissolved into chaos. Voices rose, arguments broke out. Liam confronted Sophie in a low, furious tone. Vivian snapped at the coordinator, demanding explanations that didn't exist. Guests rushed to the exits, eager to avoid being caught in someone else's scandal. And through it all, I walked. Each step felt lighter than the last. For the first time that night, I felt no shame, no anger, only release. I had come to that wedding invisible, but I left undeniable. And as I reached the doors of the Grand Oaks mansion, the last words I heard were my own, replaying softly in my mind. A maid doesn't fund your fairy tales. When I woke up the next morning, the world outside my window was quieter than usual, but my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Notifications, missed calls, and messages flooded my screen. My name was everywhere, not as the maid they laughed at, but as the woman who stood up for herself in front of 500 people at the Grand Oaks mansion. The story had spread across Charleston faster than wildfire. Everyone was talking about what happened at that wedding, about the woman who tore up a $500,000 check and walked out without flinching. I didn't bother to read most of the messages. Some called me brave, some called me cold, and a few said I'd ruined my daughter's wedding. But as I sat at my kitchen table, sipping my morning coffee from the same chipped mug I'd used for years, I didn't feel regret. I felt peace. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't pretending to be small. By noon, I started hearing from people in town, the florist, the baker, even a few of my old customers. They all said the same thing: "Good for you, Elizabeth." About time someone showed those people that money doesn't buy class. I didn't correct them. I just smiled, because deep down, I knew I hadn't done it for revenge alone. I'd done it because I'd raised my daughter to tell the truth, and somewhere along the way, that lesson had been lost. But while my name echoed through the city, the Lancasters weren't so lucky. The Charleston Gazette ran a piece about the social wedding that went wrong, hinting at unpaid vendors, forged image, and a broken partnership between two families. Their business connections started to crumble, one polite phone call at a time. The same people who toasted to their wealth were now avoiding their invitations. And as for Sophie, her perfect little world was beginning to show its cracks. Within days, I heard that Liam had stopped coming home early. A friend of mine who worked at the same law firm as his mother said the Lancaster family was furious, blaming Sophie for the humiliation. I wasn't there to see it, but I could imagine it. Sophie, sitting in that grand house, surrounded by chandeliers and silence, realizing that the fairy tale she built had come at the cost of her own mother's heart. Her friends stopped calling. The same women who had smiled at her bridal shower now whispered behind her back. The glossy photos of the wedding that once flooded her social media began to disappear, one by one. She'd built her happiness on an illusion, and now the illusion was fading under the harsh light of truth. I didn't take joy in her downfall. I couldn't. I'd been a mother too long to ever celebrate my child's pain. But there was a part of me, a small, quiet part, that finally felt understood. People were beginning to see who I truly was. Not a maid, not a burden, but a woman who had given her life to build something real. At Turner Auto Repairs, business was better than ever. Customers who'd seen the viral clips because yes, someone had filmed my speech and it had spread far beyond Charleston, started driving in just to meet me. "You're that lady from the wedding," they'd say. "You showed them." I'd smile, shake their hands, and go right back to work. Grease under my nails, sweat on my brow, that was my kind of dignity. Sometimes, after closing the shop for the night, I'd sit in the office, surrounded by the hum of machinery, and think about everything that had happened. The laughter, the whispers, the way Sophie looked at me across that ballroom, ashamed, frightened, and lost. I'd wonder if she was okay. I'd wonder if she hated me. But then I'd remember what I told myself as I walked out of that hall. They laughed at my dress, but I left wearing my dignity. That thought became my anchor. It reminded me that what I wore that night wasn't silk or lace, it was courage. It was years of hard work stitched into every fiber of my being. And while the Lancasters hid behind closed doors, avoiding the city's gossip, I faced the world head-on, knowing I had nothing left to hide. I didn't expect forgiveness, not from Sophie, not from anyone. I just wanted peace, and for the first time in years, I finally had it. One evening, As I locked up, the months passed before I saw Sophie again. Winter had turned to spring, and the air outside carried that quiet warmth that always reminded me of starting over, like life was gently nudging me forward, whether I was ready or not. I had just finished checking inventory at the shop when I heard the faint sound of heels clicking across the concrete floor. It wasn't a sound I heard often in Turner Auto Repairs. My mechanics wore boots, not designer shoes. I turned, wiping my hands on a rag, and there she was. Sophie, my daughter, standing in the doorway like she didn't quite know if she belonged there. Her hair was pulled back, no makeup this time, her face pale and tired. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It felt like time folded in on itself. The years of distance, the arguments, the humiliation, all pressed into that single moment. "Hi, Mom," she said softly. Her voice trembled just a little, but her eyes held steady on mine. I nodded, unsure how to respond. "You look thinner," I finally said. It wasn't judgment, just truth. She gave a weak laugh. "I haven't been sleeping much. Things haven't been easy." I could imagine. The Lancasters had withdrawn from the spotlight. Liam had filed for separation, from what I'd heard through the grapevine. Her glamorous life had come undone thread by thread, and now, here she was back at the very place she once avoided. She took a small step forward. "I didn't come here to ask for money," she said. "I came to ask for a job." I didn't respond immediately. My mind replayed the image of her standing on that wedding stage, calling another woman Mom. I remembered the laughter, the whispers, the sting of it all. Part of me wanted to turn her away, to remind her what her choices had cost. But then I saw something in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time: humility. "I want to earn my name back," she continued. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight. I just want to work, to learn, to be someone I can be proud of again." I set the rag down slowly, feeling the weight of every word she said. For years, I dreamed of her realizing the truth, not through pain, but through understanding. And maybe this was her first step. "Do you know how to change brake pads?" I asked, folding my arms. She blinked, a little surprised. "No, but I can learn." I smiled, not a wide smile, but one that came from deep inside. "Then start with the morning shifts. 6 a.m., no excuses. You'll start from the bottom, just like I did." She nodded quickly, relief flooding her face. "Thank you, Mom." The first time she called me Mom again, it almost broke me. I turned away before she could see my eyes glisten. Over the next few weeks, Sophie showed up every morning. No fancy clothes, no airs, just a plain shirt, her hair tied back, and a quiet determination I hadn't seen in years. She swept the floors, ran errands, fetched coffee, and learned the rhythm of the workshop. My mechanics treated her like any other new hire, firm but fair. And to my surprise, she never complained. Sometimes, I'd watch her from my office window as she stood with grease on her hands, trying to fit a part into place. She wasn't perfect at it, not by a long shot, but she kept showing up, and that meant more to me than any apology could. One afternoon, as we closed up, she turned to me and said, "You know, I used to think success was about who noticed you, but now I see it's about who stands by you." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, because she was right. As the months went by, something shifted between us. The silence that once separated us began to fill with small moments, shared meals, laughter, the occasional story about her father. The wounds were still there, but they were healing. Slowly, carefully, like scars turning into proof of survival. One evening, as I locked up the shop, the sun dipped low behind the horizon, casting a golden light across the rows of cars. Sophie stood beside me, wiping her hands clean, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something that had been missing for years: peace. I looked at her and said, "Family isn't about bloodlines or gowns. It's about truth. And sometimes, truth is the hardest thing to wear." She smiled, just faintly. "Then I'll wear it proudly." The hum of the repair tools faded into the distance as we stood there together, not as the woman who was humiliated and the daughter who betrayed her, but as two people learning how to rebuild. And maybe, just maybe, this time we'd get it right. If you're still watching this video, it means this story touched something in you. Please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see how far a mother's story can travel.